actually think it's a false narrative. As a first-year grad student, we had one of the World Trade Center engineers come and speak to a bunch of architectural engineers. This is 1994, so imagine where this industry was. This was pre-LEED. He came to us, a bunch of budding building scientists, and talked about the investment into efficiency into a building versus the investment of $1 million of marble in the front lobby. What's the payback of $1 million of marble in the front lobby? What's the payback of so many things that are fundamental to a building? And there isn't. And then you get into the energy space and everything has to have a monetary justification. That's not true. And for him, they needed to invest in the lobby to get renters in the space, because once they were 2/3 or 60%, then they were able to refinance the building. And so there was so much money to be saved when you go from the construction interest rate to the kind of ownership interest rate, that the payback was that. He didn't care about anything until it was 60% or 2/3 or whatever that number is, right? That was a good lesson for a bunch of crunchies, right? That's real life. There is a cost that we have to start accounting for that is beyond just the cost of steam, the cost of electricity, the cost of gas. It is beyond that. And for those who say that the only way that change will really occur is if we monetize that, fine, let's monetize it. I would hope that we don't have to. We do try to communicate that it's a lot deeper and a lot bigger of a question than just, hey, what's my payback? What's the cost of sea level rise? What's the cost of air pollution? Nobody's asking those questions. And our buildings have a massive impact on all of that. $264 per metric ton of carbon, right? That's the cost to society. That's not just the hard cost of carbon itself. Healthcare, asthma, like across the board, these have massive impacts. And so, we deal with probably on 80% of our projects, this question that you asked about what is the payback of X? What is the payback of Y? Why should, I do actually think it's a bit of a false narrative.
The other thing to think about is thinking creatively about where your cost boundary exists. We were working on a project where the status quo for this existing central plant had a heating hot water loop that supplies 180 degree water. And there was a new building being built on this campus. The approach would be to connect that building to the central plant.
And Justin's absolutely right. This is one of the leading airports in the world from a decarbonization perspective. They have multiple accreditations. It is very much part of their ethos. And yet, in the original kind of project description that we were given, they wanted more gas boilers. That just doesn't make sense. And so we actually recognized the disconnect and we came up with a solution, but it was a little bit more expensive, right?
It was at first, sure. But as part of the design, we realized, well, we're not sending 180 degree water, we're sending 115 or 120 degree heating hot water. And that, someone on our team said, well, that means we don't need a steel pipe wrapped in insulation. We can actually just do an HDPE plastic pipe. That saved the project $1 million in piping because of the material change. And that $1 million was able to actually offset the cost of the really funky, cool thing we did in the central plant.
Yeah, made the whole solution energy neutral or cost neutral, and yet we eliminated all the gas boilers.
And now we're all electric. We have heat recovery chillers. It's a really awesome central plant design, and it was cost neutral. Coming to terms with the cost of what we do, we can't think superficially. It can't just be, this is the initial capital cost and this is the energy savings, because there's so much more to it. There's regulations at play. If you have organizational commitments to net zero and you have an internal cost of carbon for your carbon offsets, or you've committed to installing renewable energy on site, on your roof, or on canopies for site parking, the more you drive efficiency, the less solar you need, the less offsets you need. And so all of those factors need to be included and considered if we're going to stick with the quantifiable, payback analysis, which we totally do. But my point is that it can't be so superficial.
The moment a client commits to being net zero, they cannot then follow up and ask, hey, what's the payback? If you think about the math, payback is difference in energy costs divided by the amount of money that you entered. Well, in a net zero project, alternative A has zero cost. Alternative B has zero cost. So there is no differential. Both of them are zero. And it becomes only what is the lowest first cost that we can invest in to achieve a net zero building. So it is a 180-degree different construct. Then people don't generally recognize that because they haven't committed to the net zero. They say, oh yeah, we want it, right? If you're committing to net zero, it is a different mind frame, and people have to realize that from the beginning.
We come to the table and we say, okay, we're going to do a heat pump that does this. We're going to do another heat pump that's simultaneous heating and cooling, which actually reduces the number of pieces of equipment we need. So hopefully instead of 2 pieces of equipment, we could do 1. It might be a cost saver. And because it's not so familiar, because it hasn't been done for decades, there's a few extra layers of safety factors that get applied. Understandable, engineers love safety factors, but that's a hurdle we have to overcome.
To that point, on this one project, it wasn't necessarily because the cost estimators were being overly safe, but much of it was actually through lack of communication, right? As engineers, we say, hey, price of the AV system for project X. They got it. That's pretty much all we have to say to them. And so we said, hey, price, we have this, and this, and they just went to their board and did it. Well, when we actually got in and looked at it, so what we had was a chiller that was connected to a ground loop. What did they cost? Well, they put in the cost of the chiller, and then they put in the cost of a full ground coupled heat pump loop system. So it had, a 250 ton chiller here, and then we had another 250 tons of heat pumps over here. Well, that doesn't make sense. But the cost estimator, they're not HVAC engineers. They're not experts. And so I think some of it, as Justin and I and the rest of our team push, as we were talking about earlier, right? As we're the ones who are trying to push everybody along, I do think that some of that responsibility does come into a little bit better communication and maybe evaluation to make sure that that the costs that we're seeing, are appropriate. So it is a little bit of a push back and forth, I think.
That goes back to that communication and collaboration. If we're sharing as much detail as we have in our heads about the design that we're putting out, then with our cost estimator friends and colleagues, we can come up with something that actually is realistic and represents the design we're putting forth. If we're just saying heat recovery chiller central plant, then $.